Tonight's lecture is over Chapter 2, The Chemistry of Life. All organisms and everything around them are made of matter. Matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. Matter is found on Earth in three physical states: solid, liquid, and gas. Matter is composed of chemical elements. Elements are substances that cannot be broken down into other substances. There are 92 naturally occurring elements on Earth. And when we look at Table 1 on this slide, we see 4 of those naturally occurring elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. These 4 elements that I just mentioned make up about 96% of the weight of the human body. Then most of, not all of, but most of the remaining 4% of the human body's weight is made up largely by 7 additional elements. Those 7 include calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. Then less than 0.01% of the remaining human body weight is made up of 14 trace elements. The trace elements are required in only very small amounts, but you cannot live without them. Finally, elements can combine to form compounds. Compounds are substances that contain 2 or more elements in a fixed ratio. In everyday life, compounds are much more common than pure elements. Familiar examples are relatively simple compounds such as table salt and water. Table salt is sodium chloride, consisting of equal parts of sodium and chlorine. A molecule of water has 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. Most of the compounds in living organisms contain several different elements. DNA, for example, contains carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and phosphorus. Moving on to the atom, each element consists of one kind of atom, which is different from the atoms of the other elements. An atom, named from a Greek word meaning indivisible, is the smallest unit of matter that still retains the properties of an element. In other words, the smallest amount of the element carbon is 1 carbon atom. Furthermore, atoms are composed of subatomic particles, of which the 3 most important are protons, electrons, and neutrons. A proton is a subatomic particle with a unit of positive electrical charge. An electron is a subatomic particle with a single unit of negative electrical charge. And a neutron is electrically neutral. In other words, it has no electrical charge. So let's direct our attention to the image on the right-hand side of this slide. This is an atom of the element helium, the lighter-than-air gas used in party balloons. Each atom of helium has 2 neutrons and 2 protons tightly packed into the nucleus. The nucleus is the atom's central core. 2 electrons move around the nucleus in a spherical cloud at nearly the speed of light. The electron cloud is much bigger than the nucleus. In fact, if the electron cloud were the size of a football stadium, the nucleus would be the size of a fly on the field. The attraction between the negatively charged electrons and the positively charged protons keeps the electrons moving. When the atom has an equal number of protons and electrons, as helium does, its net electrical charge is 0, and so the atom is neutral. Moving on to the next slide, elements differ in the number of subatomic particles in their atoms. The number of protons in an atom, called the atomic number, determines which element it is. For example, helium always has 2 protons and thus an atomic number of 2. Mass is a measure of the amount of material in an object. A proton and a neutron have nearly identical mass. On the other hand, an electron has so little mass, only about 1/2000th the mass of a proton, that it is usually approximated as 0. Therefore, an atom's atomic mass number is just the sum of the number of protons and neutrons in its nucleus. So for helium, the atomic mass number is 4. There's 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Both the atomic number and the atomic mass number can be read from the periodic table. And we see the periodic table in the lower right corner of this slide. And in this slide, we see a close-up view of the periodic table of the elements. The periodic table of the elements is simply a chart of the elements that includes the atomic number and the relative mass number of each element. The periodic table also provides key information about the properties of elements. The arrangement of the table also shows how the electrons in each element are organized and provides important details about how atoms will react with other atoms to form molecules. So looking at the periodic table, notice there are columns and rows. The columns are called groups, and the rows are called periods. Moving on to the arrangement of electrons. For this course, we're mainly concerned with the first 3 shells of an atom. In the first shell, there's a maximum of 2 electrons, and this shell is closest to the nucleus. So remember a few slides ago we looked at that helium atom? The helium had the 2 protons and the 2 neutrons in the nucleus, and then it had 2 electrons in its outermost shell. When an element's outermost shell is full of electrons, we call that valence. So let's go back to the periodic table. Notice in period 1, we have hydrogen on the left and helium on the right. Hydrogen is in group 1, helium's in group 18. So those 2 elements only have the innermost, or the first valence shell, which only holds 2 electrons. But then when we go into group 2, we see the lithium, the beryllium, the boron, the carbon, the nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, and neon. Of these elements that I just mentioned, the outermost shell will hold up to 8 electrons. Period 3 can hold up to 18 electrons. Most of the important elements in biology need 8 electrons in their outermost shell to be stable, and this rule of thumb is called the octet rule. So let's go back to the arrangement of electrons. So if we look at the purple cardinal numbers, in other words, first shell holds a maximum of 2 electrons, second shell holds a maximum of 8 electrons, and third shell holds a maximum of 18 electrons, but satisfies the octet rule at 8 electrons. So don't get confused. This does not mean that every atom in period 2 or period 3 has 8 electrons. To the contrary, as we move across the period from left to right, we see neon in group 18. So neon's second shell will have all of its valence electrons. In other words, it will have 8 electrons in its outermost shell. However, if we look at the element adjacent to neon, fluorine, that element is only going to have 7 valence electrons in its outermost shell. And then oxygen will only have 6 electrons in its outermost shell. So you can see a pattern developing there. This uniqueness of each element having different amounts of valence electrons in its outermost shell and also different numbers of protons and neutrons in its nucleus gives each atom a characteristic of how it will interact with other atoms. So this next slide just shows us some atoms in their period and their group and how they look. So remember, the elements in period 1 have only 2 valence electrons in their outermost shell. And then when we go into period 2, we see we add a second electron shell. And that first one there in group 1, lithium, has its 2 valence electrons in the innermost shell. That's a requirement to get to the second shell. And it has 1 electron in its outermost shell. If we were to look at group 17 and contrast that with fluorine, you see that fluorine has 7 electrons in its outermost shell. So this is setting the stage for how the elements react with each other. I've been using the word valence quite a bit. So when an element has a complete outer shell, we call that valence. If we look at group 18, we see neon has valence. It has 8 electrons in its outermost shell. Well, helium has valence to it, but it has 2 in its outermost shell. These are very stable elements. All right, we call this group 18, we call it the noble gases. And these elements are very stable. But when we look at group 1 and group 17, these elements do not have valence, but they're very close to valence. So we get what we call ionic bonds, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes, but lithium will donate an electron to fluorine and make a molecule called lithium fluoride. And then lithium has valence because its outer shell disappears because it's donated 1 electron to fluorine. Fluorine has valence because now it has 8 electrons in its outermost shell. So those 2 elements are happy. They become stable. But when they're in their elemental form, they're unstable. So let's table that discussion for now, and let's move on to isotopes. Some elements can exist in different forms called isotopes. The different isotopes of an element have the same numbers of protons and electrons, but different numbers of neutrons. So in other words, isotopes are a form of an element that differs in mass. For example, carbon-12, which is named for its mass number, with 6 neutrons and 6 protons, makes up about 99% of all naturally occurring carbon. Most of the other 1% consists of carbon-13, with 7 neutrons and 6 protons. A third isotope of carbon, carbon-14, with 8 neutrons and 6 protons, occurs in minute quantities. Notice that all 3 isotopes have 6 protons. The simplest way to put it is, if you change the number of protons in a nucleus, you change the element. Both carbon-12 and carbon-13 are stable isotopes, meaning that their nuclei remain intact more or less forever. The isotope carbon-14, on the other hand, is unstable, or what we would call radioactive. A radioactive isotope is one which the nucleus decays, giving off particles and energy. Radioactive isotopes have many uses in biological research and medicine. Cells use radioactive isotopes the same way they use non-radioactive isotopes of the same element. Once the cell takes up the radioactive isotopes, the location and concentration of the isotopes can be detected because of the radiation they emit. This makes radioactive isotopes useful as tracers, biological spies in effect, for monitoring the fate of atoms in living organisms. For example, a medical diagnosis called a PET scan works by detecting small amounts of radioactive materials introduced into the body. PET scans can diagnose heart disorders and some cancers. Although some radioactive isotopes have many beneficial uses, uncontrolled exposure to them can cause harm in living organisms by damaging cellular molecules, especially DNA. In 1986, the explosion of a nuclear reactor at Chernobyl, Ukraine, released large amounts of radioactive isotopes, killing 30 people within a few weeks and exposing thousands to an increased risk of developing cancer. In fact, the incidence of thyroid cancer among Ukrainian children increased tenfold in that decade following the accident. It should also be noted that natural sources of radiation can also pose a threat. Radon, a radioactive gas, may cause lung cancer. Radon can contaminate buildings in regions where underlying rocks naturally contain radioactive uranium. Homeowners can buy a radon detector or hire a company to test their home to ensure that radon levels are safe. Moving on to chemical bonds. Remember, a couple slides ago I was talking about chemical bonds. Chemical reactions enable atoms to give up or acquire electrons, thereby completing their outermost shells or giving them valence. Atoms do this by either transferring or sharing outer electrons. These interactions usually result in atoms staying close together. These attractions are called chemical bonds. So let's start our discussion with ions or ionic bonds. Table salt is an example of how the transfer of electrons can bond atoms together. The two ingredients of table salt are the elements sodium and chlorine. When chlorine strips an electron from the sodium atom, the electron transfer results in both atoms having full outer shells of electrons. Before the electron transfer, each of these atoms is electrically neutral. Because the electrons are negatively charged particles, the electron transfer moves one unit of negative charge from sodium to chlorine. Both atoms are now ions, the term for atoms that are electrically charged as a result of gaining or losing electrons. The loss of an electron gives the sodium ion a charge of +1, while chlorine's gain of an electron gives it a charge of -1. The sodium ion and chloride ion are held together by an ionic bond, the attraction between oppositely charged ions. Compounds such as table salt that are held together by ionic bonds are called ionic compounds. Fluorine in the Earth's crust is often found in the form of ionic compounds such as calcium fluoride, the result of bonds between calcium ions and fluoride ions. Moving on, did you know that electrolytes are ions? Ions are needed for nerve impulse conduction, muscle contractions, and for water balance. Electrolytes are often referred to as salts. You can find electrolytes in sports drinks and other dietary supplements. And when you sweat, electrolytes help replenish the salts that you lose during that process. In contrast to the complete transfer of electrons that leads to ionic bonds, a covalent bond forms when two atoms share one or more pairs of outer shell electrons. Atoms that are held together by covalent bonds form a molecule. For example, a covalent bond connects each hydrogen atom to the carbon atom in the molecule CH4 or methane. The number of covalent bonds an atom can form is equal to the number of additional electrons needed to fill its outer shell. Of the three bonds that we will discuss, ionic, covalent, and hydrogen, covalent bonds are the strongest type of bond. Covalent bonds are common in organic molecules such as carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids, and also water contains covalent bonds. Moving on, we do need to be familiar with the two types of covalent bonds. Those are nonpolar and polar covalent bonds. In nonpolar covalent bonds, two atoms will share electrons equally. There is no charge, therefore there is no attraction to other molecules. And on the other hand, in polar covalent bonds, one atom is often stronger than the other atoms, and this creates an unequal sharing. This creates a slightly positive or negative charge. For example, the covalent bond between hydrogen and oxygen in water are what we would call polar. And at the bottom of this slide, we see an example of a water molecule. Notice how the hydrogens are pulled to one side of the oxygen atom. That gives the molecule its polarity. And notice the negative signs and the plus signs in the parentheses, showing you which side of the molecule is positively charged and which side of the molecule is negatively charged. And on this next slide, we will begin to detail hydrogen bonds. Water is also a compound. Its structure consists of two hydrogen atoms joined to one oxygen atom by single covalent bonds. However, and as we detailed on the previous slide, the electrons of the covalent bonds are not equally shared between the oxygen and the hydrogen. This unequal sharing of negatively charged electrons combined with its V shape makes a water molecule polar, and polar molecules are required to have any kind of hydrogen bonding. So looking at the diagram at the bottom of the slide, we can see that the oxygen end of the molecule has a slight negative charge, while the region around the two hydrogen atoms is slightly positive. The polarity of water results in weak electrical attractions between neighboring water molecules. The molecules tend to orient such that the hydrogen atom of one molecule is near the oxygen atom of an adjacent water molecule. These weak attractions are called hydrogen bonds. Moving on to the next slide, hydrogen bonds are involved in the critical life-sustaining properties of water, and they also help to stabilize protein and DNA structures. So let's discuss a little bit why life depends upon water. Life on Earth began in water and evolved there for 3 billion years before spreading onto land. Modern life, even land-dwelling life, is still tied to water. You have had personal experience with this dependence on water every time you seek liquids to quench your thirst and replenish your body's water. Inside your body, your cells are surrounded by a fluid that's composed mostly of water, and your cells themselves range from 70 to 95% in water content. The abundance of water is a major reason why the Earth is habitable. Water is so common in our environment that it's easy to overlook its extraordinary behavior. We can trace water's unique life-supporting properties to the structure and interactions of its molecules. So as we said in the previous slide, the polarity of water molecules and hydrogen bonding that results explain most of water's life-supporting properties. One property is cohesiveness. Water molecules stick together as a result of hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonds between molecules of liquid water last only a few trillionths of a second. Yet, at any instant, many of the molecules are hydrogen bonded to others. This tendency of molecules of the same kind to stick together is called cohesion. The cohesion of water is important in the living world. Trees, for example, depend on cohesion to help transport water from their roots to their leaves. Related to cohesion is surface tension. This is a measure of how difficult it is to stretch or break the surface of a liquid. The hydrogen bonds of water give it an unusually high surface tension, making it behave as though it were coated with some kind of invisible film. Moving on to temperature, if you've ever burned your finger on a metal pot while waiting for the water in it to boil, you know the water heats up much more slowly than the metal. In fact, because of hydrogen bonding, water has a stronger resistance to temperature change than most other substances. Temperature and heat are related but different. For instance, a swimmer crossing San Francisco Bay has a higher temperature than the water, but the bay contains far more heat because of its immense volume. Heat is the amount of energy associated with the movement of the atoms and molecules in a body of matter. Temperature measures the intensity of heat, that is, the average speed of molecules rather than the total amount of heat energy in the body of matter. When water is heated, the heat energy first disrupts hydrogen bonds and then makes water molecules jostle around faster. The temperature of water doesn't go up until the water molecules start to speed up. Because heat is first used to break hydrogen bonds rather than raise the temperature, water absorbs and stores a large amount of heat while warming up only a few degrees. Conversely, when water cools, hydrogen bonds form a process that releases heat. Thus, water can release a relatively large amount of heat to the surroundings while the water temperature drops only slightly. Earth's giant water supply, such as the oceans, seas, lakes, and rivers, enables temperatures to stay within limits that permit life by storing a huge amount of heat from the sun during warm periods and giving off heat to warm the cool air during cold conditions. That's why coastal areas generally have milder climates than inland regions. Water's resistance to temperature change also stabilizes ocean temperatures, creating a favorable environment for marine life. Another way that water moderates temperature is by evaporative cooling. When a substance evaporates, in other words, it changes physical state from a liquid to a gas, the surface of the liquid remaining behind cools down. This occurs because the molecules with the greatest energy tend to vaporize first. It's as if the 5 fastest runners on your track team quit school, lowering the average speed of the running team. On a global scale, surface evaporation cools tropical oceans. On the scale of individual organisms, evaporative cooling prevents some land-dwelling creatures from overheating. This is why sweating helps you to maintain a consistent body temperature even when exercising on a hot day. And the old adage, "It's not the heat, it's the humidity," has its basis in the difficulty of sweating water into the air that is already saturated with water vapor. Moving on to the next slide. When most liquids get cold, their molecules move close together. If the temperature is cold enough, the liquid freezes and becomes a solid. Water, however, behaves differently. When water molecules get cold enough, they move apart, forming ice. A chunk of ice has fewer molecules than an equal volume of liquid water. It floats because it's less dense than the liquid around it. Like water's other life-supporting properties, floating ice is a consequence of hydrogen bonding. In contrast to the short-lived hydrogen bonds in liquid water, those in solid ice last longer, with each molecule bonded to 4 neighbors. As a result, ice is a spacious crystal. So the question becomes, how does the fact that ice floats help support life on Earth? Well, just imagine what would happen if ice sank. All ponds, lakes, and even the oceans would eventually freeze solid. During the summer, only the upper few inches of the oceans would thaw. Instead, when a deep body of water cools, the floating ice insulates the liquid below, allowing life to persist under the frozen surface. Water is also an excellent solvent. If you've ever enjoyed a glass of sweetened iced tea or added salt to your soup, you know that you can dissolve sugar or salt in water. This results in a mixture known as a solution, a liquid consisting of a homogeneous mixture of 2 or more substances. The dissolving agent is called the solvent, and a substance that is dissolved is called the solute. When water is the solvent, the resulting solution is called an aqueous solution. The fluids of organisms are aqueous solutions. Water can dissolve an enormous variety of solutes necessary for life. Water is the solvent inside all cells, in blood, and in plant sap. As a solvent, it is a medium for chemical reactions. Water can dissolve salt ions, as is shown in the cartoon to the left-hand side of this slide. Each ion becomes surrounded by oppositely charged regions of water molecules. Solutes that are polar molecules, such as sugars, dissolve by orienting locally charged regions of their molecules towards water molecules in a similar way. And now we're going to move on to acids, bases, and pH. In the aqueous solutions within organisms, most of the water molecules are intact. However, some of the water molecules actually break apart into hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. A balance of these 2 ions is critical for the proper functioning of the chemical processes within an organism. A chemical compound that releases hydrogen ions to a solution is called an acid. One example of a strong acid is hydrochloric acid, the acid in your stomach. In solution, hydrochloric acid breaks apart into the ions hydrogen and chloride. A base or alkaline compound is a compound that accepts hydrogen ions and removes it from the solution. Some bases, such as sodium hydroxide, do this by releasing hydroxide ions, which combines with the hydrogen ions to form water. In order to describe the acidity of a solution, chemists use something called the pH scale. The pH scale is a measurement of hydrogen ion concentration in a solution. The scale ranges from 0, which is the most acidic, to 14, which is the most basic. Each pH unit represents a tenfold change in the concentration of hydrogen ions. For example, lemon juice, with its pH of 2, has 100 times more hydrogen ions than an equal amount of tomato juice that has a pH of 4. Pure water and aqueous solutions that are neither acidic nor basic are said to be neutral, and they have a pH of 7. They do contain hydrogen and hydroxyl ions, but the concentration of the two ions are equal. Moving on to buffers, even a slight change in pH can be harmful to an organism because the molecules and cells are extremely sensitive to hydrogen and hydroxide ion concentration. So biological fluids contain buffers. Buffers are substances that prevent harmful changes in pH by accepting hydrogen ions when that ion is in excess and donating hydrogen ions when it is depleted. This buffering process, however, is not foolproof, and changes in the environmental pH can profoundly affect an ecosystem. For example, much of the human-made CO2 released into the atmosphere is absorbed by the oceans. When CO2 combines with seawater, a chemical reaction produces an acid. The resulting ocean acidification can greatly change marine environments. This principle was illustrated by a 2008 study of the Mediterranean Sea near Naples, Italy. There, undersea volcanoes release high levels of CO2. Researchers found that the resulting acidification caused coral reefs to collapse and widespread death of marine organisms. The effects of ocean acidification are daunting reminders that the chemistry of life is linked to the chemistry of the environment. It reminds us, too, that chemistry happens on a global scale, since industrial processes in one region of the world often cause acid rain to fall in another part of the world. So let's do a quick recap of tonight's lecture. After tonight's lecture, and after studying this chapter, you should be able to identify where the protons, neutrons, and electrons are found in an atom. You should be able to identify various facts about an atom based off of the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. You should also understand what an isotope is. Furthermore, you should be able to identify and understand why electrons are so influential in the chemical bond formation between atoms. You should also know about the octet rule and its role in chemical bonds. You should also be able to understand the characteristics of ionic and covalent bonds, not to mention the difference between polar and non-covalent polar bonds. You should also be able to explain hydrogen bonding and what unique qualities hydrogen bondings have. Furthermore, you should be able to describe the properties of water that are critical to maintaining life. You should be able to compare the amounts of hydrogen and hydroxide ions in an acid, base, and at a neutral pH. And you should understand how bodily pH is maintained and why maintaining it is so important.